The Why Didn't You Test That podcast want to improve your software. Join Huw, Rich and their guests. They share experiences and insights on the many sides of better software delivery.
We're back, and today we're going to be talking loosely about the concept of virtualization. And we have with us John Power, who is the CEO of Ostia Solutions based in Ireland, in the same office as us, actually. We've worked with John for a very, very, very long time. We worked when we were with Grid Tools. We were doing a lot of work with test data, and we kind of joined up a lot of our tools with some of the Ostia tools as well. So we called them and they called us, which was great. We did some work with them through CA, and we're now kind of back building some new technologies together. I think you had a nice session the other day in Dublin with young James, I believe, John, as well.
Indeed, yeah.
I was just hearing about all the bright ideas you've had, which is good. So maybe it would be good if, John, if you just start a little bit about Ostia, if people haven't heard about the company, maybe just a little bit about the history. And then if you could then maybe just spend a little bit of time talking about the history of virtualization, and maybe Rich and I will chime in with a few of our what we've seen in that space, and then we'll kind of evolve on from there, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So Ostia was formed in 2012, actually, from an older company, but our history is very much tied to Mainframe, I guess, quite a lot like Huw and Rich, right? So we originally had an integration product, but found that quite difficult to sell. But we then got into the world of service virtualization. The concept being that we were seeing companies or organizations with large mainframes initially struggling very, very hard to test, because it's a limited resource, they're difficult to get at, you're standing on each other's toes all the time. So the idea of service virtualization is very much around simulating your interactions with the back office. So in most cases with MQ, with web services, which were around a lot of the time, there's a request response type algorithm. So you would send a request, get a response back. And what we did originally, and that's not just us, but that's the concept of service virtualization originally, was that you stick yourself in the middle as a proxy and you record the requests and the responses as they are processed by the back office mainframe system. And that doesn't have to be mainframe, it could be any system, to be honest. So what happens then is that when you want to test, you can replay those without having the mainframe in play. And it meant that you could actually run some interesting testing as it went along. And part of the reason why we got involved with Huw and the Grid Tools team was because we felt that the actual API simulation was only half the battle. It's only 50% of the battle. You really need a lot of data as well around that, and you need good test data. So that kind of evolved for us, and we started integrating our products, as you said, and we really had a nice set of tools that were generating data into the recording. So you weren't actually having to record everything. We were generating data into those recordings. But what we came across was a lot of issues that there were with service virtualization, and there's quite a few, as it turns out. So one is that you need to have access to the back office system for your recording and replay. That mightn't sound to be such a big problem, but more and more, organizations don't want you accessing these systems. The second thing we found is that recordings were going out of date really, really quickly. Possibly most important was the fact that you could play a recording out of sequence. So if you're recording a process that creates an account, creates transactions based on that account, retrieves those transactions, you can actually retrieve the transactions, add the transaction, and then create the account. So it doesn't lend itself very, very well. It doesn't lend itself at all well to process testing. And very, very, very rarely does a business process consist of one call into the system. There's generally sequences of calls that must be tested. So we then started moving into the whole idea of sandboxing and full simulations of the back office system. And to do that, we totally kind of threw away most of our technology and started again and created a sandbox with the APIs, but also with a data model behind those APIs. And along with that, we enhanced our support, not just MQ and COBOL and XML and XSDs and all that sort of stuff, but also REST and XML and REST and JSON. So it evolved to supporting all of the new and modern technologies. But again, our feeling is that 50% of the thing is the API, or 50% of the environment is the API, and 50% is the data. So that's why we've got a very, very good fit here. And one of the things we're seeing is more and more is that, people don't believe that it's possible necessarily to simulate these things, but we have a very good example of how we created a full simulation of the open banking model in the UK using this technology. So you got a full experience of what the real system looked like by using a test system. And we're very, very pleased with that. And one of the things we're seeing now more and more is that we feel that sandboxes have been abused over the years. They generally come as an afterthought. So, we build all our technology out, we do all our good stuff, and then we build a sandbox. And it generally doesn't get a lot of effort, doesn't get a lot of love and care, and they're generally very, very poor implementations. In fact, we've seen more and more with the whole Payment Service Directive, where all of the banks in the UK and Ireland had to provide a sandbox for testing, is that nobody, the TPPs, or the organizations that are entitled to use these APIs, don't use the sandbox for testing. They use the production system. So they go in and they open an account in HSBC or in RBS so that they can actually test their APIs, which if risk managers understood the concept there, I think they'd be pretty worried. So we see a scenario where... Sorry?
Yeah. Well, let's just pause there for a second, if you don't mind, because we've kind of tripped on a little bit. So let's just move back a little bit. Maybe we'll just talk a little bit more, go back over maybe Rich and then mine experiences of the kind of original virtualization. And let's just delve into that a little bit, because I think the history is actually quite a useful story as to kind of almost the bad taste it kind of left in people's mouths, really. And I think then, people then moved away from it. Whereas I think what you're doing now is because you've kind of thought about it differently, and I think we'll get onto it later on in terms of how you change your organization to take advantage of this new thinking and of this new approaches. Then it's something that people should really be embracing. But maybe Rich, if you just talk about your exposure to it.
Yeah. So I ran a service virtualization team, a central service virtualization team. Changed my teeth in a minute. For a number of years, and it's quite interesting the way John articulated in terms of it's almost an afterthought. And I think there's an anti-pattern in what I said in terms of we ran a centralized service virtualization service, right? Because we weren't the test team, we weren't the development team, we weren't the environment build team, right? We were a team removed from any of those things, right? And we started there, and we realized that actually we didn't really know what the interface was supposed to be doing. We didn't know what they were supposed to be testing. And what do you know, if we didn't engage with the kind of the larger integration environment folks, we were never going to remove anything, right? And so to me, there is a fundamental, like you say, a misunderstanding. I'll go broader than that in terms of testers don't really get the data and the environments they're supposed to be testing within. I don't necessarily think they have a great understanding of interface testing, and therefore that's why you get this kind of black hole when it comes to interfaces. I think there's a problem when it comes to design of interfaces, right? I think, you've got Conway's law, which kind of an organization, kind of its communication channels, your architecture will mimic its communication channels, right? And you've got silos of teams, and those teams don't talk to each other, and therefore you've got this big monolithic thing where people don't really understand the interfaces. And I think that then transcends into what we found ourselves in, is that no one really pays any attention, and they chuck it to this centralized team to try and create service virtualization. What do you know? It doesn't really work. And, for the former years of trying to get this thing working, we were kind of saying, test team, we really need a structured approach to the way you're targeting things, right? Get your API-based testing in place, get your end-to-end test if that's the case, but we need to understand how your data flows over those things. Designers or developers, contract-based development, for example, are you talking to your nearest neighbor to understand the interface change you're making? And no, they're not, right? And we seem to have this mass event where everybody tries to prove these things in big monolithic test environments, right? And so almost service virtualization isn't given an opportunity, I don't think, in a lot of occasions, when it absolutely could solve a lot of the speed, flow, black hole technical debt problems that so many organizations are facing. And I think, almost taking a step back and starting to understand where those interfaces lie, how you break them up, how you design better at those levels. I think this is where, you get into a place where service virtualization and sandboxing absolutely thrives. But I think that's, it's a cultural shift away from just this is a technology that enables us to remove a kind of an interface. It's a million miles away from that, right? You've got to bring the whole thing in, and I think a lot of organisations really don't get those kind of those missing pieces of technical debt.
Okay, that sounds about right. Yeah, so let me just talk a little bit about kind of my experience of how the journey into virtualization. I mean, we were sort of heavily into test data. We did lots of synthetic test data. At the time, service virtualization was kind of flavor of the month, and it was predominantly to do with the fact that you could charge people a fortune for turning their mainframes off. So suddenly these very simple products, because they were pretty simple, they were just recording a message stack, sticking it in a database, and then replaying it, were being able to charge silly money. In my mind, it was sort of crazy, up to $1 million, $2 million being spent on something. But in terms of the savings, it was worthwhile for the customers because they could then just turn off the mainframes and work, at different times of the day, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it sort of skewed the whole virtualization space because you had this incredibly expensive products, whereas to be honest, you could kind of do a lot of this stuff yourself, and it was a lot about kind of building. And to be honest, you can download a product and build your own virtualization. A lot of it is now open source and freeware now. So that was kind of the first thing. I think the other thing that happened, and I mean this happened the other day. We were doing a presentation to I shall loosely call my worst enemy middle managers in IT who don't know anything about IT. But have risen to a level of, way above their competence. And they had, had a presentation for a company that, said, oh yeah, we do virtualization. And we can virtualize everything for you, and we're going to save you a fortune. And it was massive slideware, and they had absolutely no concepts of, anything down. Where do you break the system? How do you keep them in sync? What was the difference between end-to-end testing? What's the difference between contract testing, etc. They've just been told this massive sort of fantasy. And the trouble is with those fantasies, it takes 2 or 3 years to work through the system, and then what you kind of John was talking about was basically the kind of disillusionment then when it didn't kind of solve everything. In the meantime, the software vendors wandered away with quite a lot of money. Worth the value? No, absolutely not. The other one that we came across was a lot. They seem to end up with a lot of bodies involved with these. I mean, I worked on one site and they had a team of 50 people creating request response pairs, and each worker bee basically would be lucky to create one request response a day. So they, a request would come from a team to say, oh, we need to test this really complicated endpoint, and here are the 17 variables that we care about, and here's a requirement document written in English. Which is usually pretty bad to decipher. And then we need you to create us some meaningful responses. And they say, yeah, we can do that for you. It'll take us 2 months. And they would disappear for 2 months, and then they would come back and build this thing. And it wasn't stateful either. So you added an account, and you did a request on that account. The account would tell you it's this account, but that account didn't exist, So it just became such a sort of ball-busting pain to get all this stuff done, with all of these people's bodies and misapprehensions in terms of where, what was expected and what was being delivered, I think. So that's kind of the history. Now it's sort of moved into more of a kind of a sort of an open sourcey ad hoc type of thing, which is probably, not doing anyone any good either, so I think now is the time for the rethink, really. So anyway, so that's kind of my history, which probably echoes some of your stuff as well. So John, maybe you kind of jumped ahead a little bit.
Yep.
In that you've sort of rethought it. So maybe just talk us through your thinking about what you went through when you rethought it and how you went about that.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things we've seen over the years is that, we were looking at this and, why projects fail. And we've all been involved, I suspect, with projects that have failed to a greater or lesser extent. We got to thinking why, and part of the reason we believe is because when we're creating projects, we put a really nice design in place, and then we go straight into implementation. And if you look at people building a bridge, it's equally complex, but they actually prototype the bridge first. So they'll actually put the bridge together, look at it, poke at it, and So we thought that actually building the sandbox first can give you an ability to test what you're doing, to test what you're trying to do, and not just first, but also in terms of going back to Rich's point about going back to ground zero. Let's try and simulate what we have, because we found with some of these simulations, people actually can discover how their systems, their existing systems are working, and to mirror that. So the whole idea will be that you can then, we can all argue about what the happy path is, but it's generally 20-25% of the code. So it's very easy to put together a mock-up of what you want in terms of APIs. One of the things we're looking at actually, and you were talking to James about this, is to actually put your modeler on top of that, so you've got your test and your APIs together, and you then get if you've got somebody developing a mobile app, you actually use the sandbox and you develop something within a matter of weeks that you can show to people, and they'll say, oh, that's crap, don't want it. But you go through a fail fast, quick cycle of saying, now, is everyone happy? Are the guys that are getting the mobile app happy? Yeah. Can the mobile guys that are developing the app, have they all the data they need? Have they got all the APIs they need? Yep. So if everyone's happy, then you can move to the next phase, and you've got a set of assets, which is the sandbox plus potentially a test modeler with test functionality to move to the next phase. And we see that as being a way of bringing people through a cycle, so that instead of the sandbox being an afterthought, it becomes an upfront thought that enables you to start developing and planning and controlling your APIs as well, in a way that you can kind of make these things available so that people can see. We see a scenario where you've got a catalog of these, so you know what's available, and you can't. Rich mentioned the central team. We see a central team managing these, in the sense that you don't develop a new API unless the central team says yeah, or else they say, well, look, actually you can use this one with a small change, and then you make sure it doesn't break the changes. But then you can very quickly build up your sets of assets that you have around the place, and it gives you a much more we believe a much more stable and controlled and controlled way of developing the APIs and developing as you go.
Yeah, we've sort of been moving into the master data management space kind of big time. I think when we kind of built up our set of products this time, we realized version management was sort of critical. Even with our old products, it was pretty hard. Once a new release of anything came out, you'd have to spend probably several days, if not longer, kind of bringing up together all of our tools to make them to work in the next release, whereas now it's kind of built in fundamentally. And if you think about APIs, request response pairs, you're moving quickly. That's the whole point. You should be able to reuse those assets and upgrade within a matter of, first of all, you can impact, if I make this change, what are the contracts that are affected, which sandboxes are affected, which test environments are affected, which versions are affected, how does that tie in, and that should be immediately obvious. So I think this whole master data management and then tying things together is absolutely spot on. And in terms of I think calling it a sandbox is slightly underplaying it. It is an intelligent piece of kit, and the intelligence that I've seen that you've been able to build almost immediately. You have to do a little bit more work with the more sophisticated types of transactions. Is pretty functional. So you've almost created like a little fake system really quickly, and basically, you've either stuck MySQL or SQL Server at the end of it. Now, that's actually really useful, because what you find is you can, if you've got it in a backend database, you can use our tools then to do a snapshot. So you can say, well, we've just pushed all this data in. Let's see what data has actually been put into the database, and we diff it. And we say, well, you just ran this front-end system of your mobile app, and this is the data that was captured. And there it is. You know what it is. It's not a set of messages you've got to interpret or work out later. But it's all in a sandbox. And then you go, aha, this is wrong. And coming back to your point before about finding stuff out, you said, do we have the right data? That's extraordinary how people miss that. Sometimes it's best if you start with a reporting system and actually work your way back to the transactional system, which is completely the wrong way that people do it. You then find out, well, in the reporting system, because my end user who is expecting all this information, but we don't track it, or we don't track it in a way that is easy to dig it out of the system, and that's happened so often. So, okay, so all right, Rich, what's your thoughts on this?
There's something that always sticks with me, which was autonomy and alignment. Autonomy and alignment, right? Which is something that you, if you follow DevOps things, you'll hear people say this a lot, but it doesn't really mean anything, I don't think, but it does, right? So three ways of DevOps. You've got flow, feedback, and experimentation, right? And I think John's probably mentioned a few of them already, right? In terms of, and this is where service virtualization gives you the opportunity to do those things. So as a team wanting to adopt Agile or DevOps or whatever, right? You want to have autonomy away from the rest of the organization, right? And how do you achieve that? Well, you create these sandboxes around what you're doing, right? Or for what you're doing, so you can create fast flow to get to a point of having a prototype, right? And that gives you your fast feedback. Your alignment part is around, okay, so you need to have consciousness around your autonomous thing won't stay in isolation for eternity, right? Eventually it will have to integrate with the rest of the organization. And so finding that happy medium, as kind of IT is an emergent practice, and therefore as you go through the development lifecycle, you've got this fast feedback loop that allows you to work with autonomy, but then you know that you've got alignment with the rest of the organization because you're conscious of the fact that you need to build these things out with what already exists there. I think there's a real kind of linkage into teams that are quite mature in their thinking around putting these things in, do service virtualization. I think, ones that aren't, I think there's a problem there in terms of, yes, they might work with autonomy at the start, and they might get away with doing some experimentation in isolation, but when they want to pop out of that thing, they don't know anything about the kind of the surrounding environment, and they need to find themselves in this big monolithic world again, and they're not very well aligned to it. No conversations have ever happened. I think there's a massive problem in terms of the teams that aren't really thinking about, not just what is the technology of service virtualization and sandboxing, but how do you actually implement it in an effective way.
So John, maybe this is a chance for you to kind of just talk through, how quickly you can spin up a sandbox now, because I think for these teams that aren't familiar with it or haven't really thought about it Rich is articulating the problem there, but he's not really articulating how you would take, say, and I would probably say it's three out of four, maybe 4 out of 5 teams are in should we call it the bad camp. They start off well, but then they get kind of bogged down. So John, how quickly do you reckon, given a sort of, let's say, 4 or 5 Swagger specs with maybe, 20 or 30 endpoints in there, how quickly could you get something put together, from a, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 kind of thing?
What we try to do, the basic model is, what we basically do first is we create the framework. So that would give you a functional set of API endpoints that actually, with a data model, and that's done literally in minutes. So it's just part of the product. And then you go in, you started building in your business rules. So depending on how complex the business rules, the second thing is we're actually a low code product at the moment. We've got a lot of configuration, and we're trying to, for validation and for moving of payloads between payloads, we've got some configuration based approach there as well, which helps because people can then configure their validation rules, the rules for the data they need to be able to create, and also in terms of how they create payloads. And then you plug in your business rules. So what we actually want to move to, anyway, and that takes, that can take a couple of days to get something where you have a usable sandbox that can then evolve. And as you go through the process, you can be adding data, create account, create transactions. What you're doing is you're putting in logic to say, when I create an account, does the account already exist? If it does, you get an error. When I create a transaction, is the account for that transaction, does it exist? So that's the type of business logic you're putting in there. And the framework facilitates that because it's using this whole Spring Boot scenario. So for us, it's key that you can then build and keep building on that. Rome wasn't built in a day. We're not suggesting that you just do this in 2 days and it's all done. You're continually evolving it, and the key to it is that you do continually evolve it and see it as a part or as an asset as part of your organization. Yeah. I think also you mentioned the whole master data management thing. That goes a step level. Your metadata master management is a key part of this as well, because we're duplicating. We've got massive duplication of fields of of fields of APIs all over the place. So if we take just one small Swagger we had the other day, and the same field was referred to by 3 different field names, which makes no sense. Because, it works, but if you want to standardize across your organization, that field should have one name everywhere. So where we see this going as well is giving us an ability to start helping organizations to look at their master data management as well, around the metadata, a lot like you guys do with the data, because you guys understand all that data, and that's something.
Yeah, when you were talking about the model and being able to create the test cases, I mean, we can also help you create the payloads as well, because we can build the test cases, the input data, and part of the payload. So we might have matched you to a broker, but you need the broker ID in your system, so we could just build out as part of that, as part of these sort of setups.
Yeah, another really nice part of this is that one of the issues that people have with service virtualization is, how do I keep it up to date? How do I create an API, I create some recordings, how do I ensure they're up to date? So part of what we're doing, and where we see that, working with the model management here, is that you create your test cases, you create your test data, so you've got both sides of the sandbox essentially together, and you have that to run against the sandbox, but you also have it to run against your real APIs. So you come to a point where you every day or every week or whatever you feel is needed, you run those tests against your API and your sandbox, so you can ensure they're kept in sync. Because that's a huge question people have had over time. So it's just and that's a huge issue that needs to be done. And it's all about version management, as you said, in terms of ensuring that your sandbox correctly maps or mirrors what's in test and effectively in production at the end of the day.
Good. So maybe, again, you kind of alluded now to open banking. Maybe you could sort of talk us through some of the war stories there. Because originally, when I spoke to you about this a couple of years ago, you thought, wow, everyone's going to do this. So what really happened?
Well, what happened was, as I say, the open banking was, within the EU, there was a thing called Payment Service Directive 2, which said that everybody should have access to their banking data. The problem they had was that they said, thou shalt do it, but in the EU's wisdom, they said, we don't care how you do it, which kind of defeated the purpose. So in the UK, I think they did a great job of it, to be honest, because they created this thing called the Open Banking Implementation Entity. They created a set of standards and said every large bank in the UK must follow that standard. So we were able to, and the same thing happened in Ireland, obviously, because we followed. It made sense to follow through on that. So they probably over-engineered the APIs, if we're going to be a little bit critical, but at least all of the banks were doing the same API. So anybody interacting with those banks should theoretically be able to connect to any bank they want with the same set of software. Part of that deal was they were supposed to provide sandboxes for those, so you could actually test in isolation and get your application ready and then connect to the production systems. And what they did was, basically people did a very, very poor job of creating sandboxes. So they created a sandbox with 2 accounts, 2 transactions. You can test nothing with that in terms of data. If you're a programmer, if you cannot call an API, you shouldn't be called a programmer. It's simple as that. So you want to be able to test the whole process, and that whole open banking process had a whole security profile associated with it. So you had to go through a series of steps to get on board with the banks to enable you to use those APIs correctly. And that process wasn't being mirrored in most of the sandboxes that we came across. But just to compare it and contrast it with Europe, they had a thing called the Berlin Standard and STET in Europe, and they weren't standards, they were kind of nice to have. So everybody took a little bit of everything. So now what you have in continental Europe is you've got brokers who will talk to all of the banks for you and give you one API, which is the whole focus of what the PSD2 directive was trying to do. So you've really lost again, because you have to pay a broker in the middle to do this again. So and we're seeing a lot of what are called the TPPs, who are the third party providers, who they're the guys that are supposed to be using the APIs, and they, as I said earlier on, they do a lot of their testing against production systems, because in the sandboxes they don't have enough data. The process doesn't map the production process. So if they onboard and test with the test system, they were making the same effort to onboard with the production system. So a lot of people kind of went and onboarded with the production systems instead. So I think it'll come back, it'll get better. But there's a certain, the Gartner trough of disillusionment, or whatever they call it, where everyone spent all this money and they're kind of going, why do we spend it? they don't see any benefit. Whereas any bank worth its salt knows it has to go with APIs if it wants to survive into the future, because otherwise there's going to be smaller players eating their lunches, nibbling away at their lunch all the time. They also understand, and we're dealing with we're working with MasterCard, I think I told you guys, and they're seeing their lunch being eaten very quickly by people like Stripe, right? And other companies where you can, years ago you used to sign a banking agreement. Now you just sign on to Stripe and you can kind of fire away your credit card. So they're now really, really keen on giving developers a good customer experience, and that's where they're working with, proper sandboxes that fully simulate the whole process. There's two reasons for that. One is for their partners to test, but also so that they can work with anybody without any fear of their systems being compromised, because the sandbox is standalone with synthetic data in the cloud. So if something goes wrong there, you don't really care. And if you see an application, there might be one in every 200 that you see that's interesting to you, you can take them on board and bring them through the process. And we see that the more and more of the banks now, the high street banks, are going to start doing the same thing as time moves on.
I mean, that kind of figures about.
Why
Go ahead.
I was going to say, why do you think that the kind of the financial services organisations within open banking did such a poor job at kind of their sandboxes in that kind of arena?
Well, because one, they didn't want it. They didn't want. Most of them seem to be brought kicking and screaming to the table. They, for some reason, saw the data as being their data, not our data. Not my data or your data. Was the first thing. The second thing was that it's the typical attitude. Sandbox. You need something to connect to.
Yeah.
There was a couple that did. RBS did a lot of work, and they enabled you to load up. They did quite a good job, I found. But a lot of them were just giving you 2 records, 2 transactions, and it was really just your typical project. We come to the end of the project. We spent all our resources implementing the thing. So providing a sandbox was an afterthought, and something we have to do. We get a tick box, tick, and that's it. So,
but they would have to provide an interface and therefore environment to those other organisations needing to interface with them, right? So it's a false game, isn't it?
You would have thought it's, but they didn't care. They didn't seem to care.
No, I know.
Sorry, we don't care if our sandbox is rubbish. We've with a lot of people, it was a tick box. We have to implement this regulation, so let's do it, and we'll do it under duress, and we'll only take everything as far as we need to take it.
It reminds me a little bit. So when outsourcing was all the rage, it's not so much nowadays. One of the problems actually. I remember talking to Nationwide about this, was the problem with outsourcing. You give them a fairly loose spec. They would then deliver the code, and then you'd spend the next 6 months fixing the code because the spec you gave them was pretty pants, and you didn't really think about things. Yeah. Whereas actually, if you think about it the other way around, is to say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to create you all of the data to test this thing. So we're going to create you all the scenarios, we're going to create all the data, and we're actually going to spend some time getting that stuff right. Now, the problem with that is you've got to think up front. You've got to spend a little bit of time thinking about it and organize yourselves to do that. And what you're doing is you're giving a much, much tighter spec, because if you create the data that they're going to be doing processing, then you're also going to be creating the expected results, and you're going to be expecting the report to look like this and this and that and that and this. And by spending, and it's the classic, by spending probably a month up front, you're going to probably save yourself 3 to 6 months later on. And, whether it was in a database or whether it's in basically a sandbox, and if you then introduce the level concept of coverage, where you say what we're also going to do is put in covered combinations. So we're going to we want you to be able to handle all the variations of this, which could be in the n to the power of n to the power of n, which is fine because that's what happens in the real world. And we're going to create you, possibly 20, 30, 70,000 different variations of these, and this category should do this and this category should do that, and all that types of stuff. So once you introduce coverage, you're actually giving them an incredibly really nailed down piece of technology for them to develop too, which is good for everyone. Yep. And it seems to be we're back in exactly the same world with sandboxes here. So I'm going to chuck this over to you now, Rich. Now, one of the things that you kind of love, which I love you talking about, is blast radiuses. Now, if you think about how you loose couple and break systems up, and maybe just talk about how you separate the testing and the development within these systems. And, and I think if you could get to this thing where you can, within a week have a decent reactive set of sandboxes for, about half of my dependent systems, what effect would that have?
Yeah. So the concept is pretty easy, and kind of John alluded to a bit of it earlier on, where he talked about kind of a business process has got a number of API calls underneath it, right? And if I'll use an example of a mortgage process, right? Because for some reason, open banking, mortgages is financial services. If you imagine the kind of a mortgage process, there's lots of steps along that process where those API calls will go off to either various systems within that organization or various third-party systems to go and pull back various information. And so when you're making a change to that kind of that process, chances are you're only making a small change to one little bit of it, right? So the example I'll pick on is if you're doing a credit score for a mortgage application, right? If you're making a change to that, chances are you've got a UI page that maybe calls back some customer information, but that third-party call, it will go off to a third-party provider, right? And within that kind of little scenario there are various things that you can do to isolate what you're actually doing versus the rest of the process, right? So why do you need customers from a customer database, right? That's not really that important when it comes to how you're trying to test this process, right? Yes, the amount they earn or what credit score you're going to get returned back, that's important, right? So that's the kind of the data and considerations you need in your test process. Do you need to get that from the source system? No, you don't, right? You could mock that data up and you could get a call from the customer database. If you're going out to credit score, Experian, that's who I'm talking about here, then you can go and mock those kind of responses out or sandbox those responses out really, really easily, right? And the converse of kind of doing limiting blast radius and then focusing your testing, the reverse of that is if you imagine I didn't do any of these things, I'm doing that end-to-end process. I need my customer database, which is probably a mainframe, let's face it, these things are old. I'm probably going to need some kind of ledger system on there, which again is going to be a mainframe. If I'm going out to Experian, they're probably going to force me to use their I think it's third-party provider responses that's got real customer data in it. I'm getting all of this accidental complexity because I'm choosing not to use a bit of intelligence up front to isolate what I'm actually doing. And I think there's a hell of a lot of that problem around not thinking up front and looking at the opportunities to concentrate our testing effort and everything that falls off the back of that, which includes where can I actually virtualize out kind of inconsequential things. So by that I mean the third-party system, which I have no control over changing, so I'm not going to change it. I could remove that, right, and replace it with a sandbox. I think maybe the initial barrier to that entry is we don't necessarily know what that third party does, but I think this is where a lot of people shy off and then revert back to, okay, so we have to call out to that third party. No. At that point, you need to go and engage them to try and kind of loose couple yourself from them and build out that sandbox understanding, right?
I mean, you sort of have to do it anyway. So if we're talking about the credit stuff anyway, so if you're trying to write a spec to say, based on these 17 pieces of information, we are going to then make an evaluation on a mortgage, all right? Now, they're giving you 17 pieces of information, all right? Now, you then have to go and find 17 times, 3 data states times 17 to try and basically test your system. So the concept of using any kind of live data, I mean, it's like trying to create historical data. One of the biggest problems of trying to test historical data is you just don't have that customer with that historical data. Whereas you can do that so easily with sandboxes. You just give it enough of the characteristics you want to test, apply some coverage techniques, bingo.
Absolutely, and to me, almost, the argument around using that end-to-end environment is illogical, right? Because, like you say, you have to do those equivalence partitions to actually test how those responses will work, right? If you don't do it, then you've got a hell of a lot of risk there in terms of how the system will work. You've also got a lot of bloat because you're probably sending more requests and therefore data to that system than you ever needed to, right? So you've got risk and extra effort built into the fact that you're either not thinking, you're being a bit lazy up front. It's just totally illogical.
Yeah, I know. We came across one the other day where there was one person creating one message a day, and they were just creating it by hand.
That's an interesting one.
And there were 5 of them, and they were producing basically 25 messages a week. And that was a testing strategy.
I do think there's a real problem or opportunity for, and I think John mentioned it earlier on, around how do you almost intertwine the use of service virtualization of sandboxes into the whole development version controlling of interfaces as they get developed, because like John said, it's an evolving beast, right? And they have to stay aligned to keep that conversation going, that confidence level there. I think the interesting thing is, if you're not confident you have to be as confident in the service virtualization as you are as the interface it's replacing. If you're not, then you haven't got a problem with the service virtualization, you've got a problem with your understanding of the interface, right? And I think that's something that doesn't necessarily transcend.
All right, well, I'll say one thing. I'm going to let John wrap this up then. So, I know, John, you wrap it up. Never mind. Back to you.
No. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's about control there, as you were saying, Rich. But it's also about doing a bit of thinking. If you put a bit of effort in up front, a week or two, everyone goes, oh, we don't have a week or two. If you take a week or two and you set yourself up correctly with the data you need, the testing you need, with the sandboxing, whatever, you suddenly you give yourself a huge head start in terms of delivering something that's far more usable than trying to work it out as you go along. But also, people see these as being throwaway assets. They're not. They're things that you can continually evolve. And as you just said there, Rich, you can actually ensure that the upgrade of your sandbox, of your sandbox data, of your sandbox testing models, it's all tied to, I'm going to make a change to this now. What do we need to change? So you get version 1.1, version 1.2.
Actually, sorry,
and you have those.
I remember what I was talking about. So basically, there was if we're dealing with a company and they had an internal Swagger spec, okay, which was exposed to customers, okay. So customers could use the Swagger spec. Now, for them to create the sandbox, fair enough, you'd start with the Swagger spec. Now, when we looked at their Swagger spec, it was horribly broken. Okay. Now, we then had to spend quite a lot of time fixing their Swagger spec. Now, you can imagine a development team saying, right, this other team is going to try and create a sandbox so we don't have to rely on you. We need you to go and fix your own Swagger spec. They don't care. They genuinely don't care. They're busy doing their own things as well as it's your problem, So you can see the sort of politics of dealing internally within that company, in that, oh, well, we're doing our thing, you're not important to us, but they're actually the business intelligence, and the business intelligence team is trying to use your Swagger specs, and they're trying to create a sandbox so they can build all this complex data, so they can build lovely dashboards and blah, blah, blah. But the development team didn't give a monkeys. So in our world, because we were trying to set up a full API testing thing, we had to go and spend 3 or 4 days with our developers fixing their Swagger spec for them. Then we get back to them. But I mean, that's the kind of sort of grit in the machine here that you kind of come across.
Yeah. There's a huge problem there in terms of the quality of what comes out, and the other problem is that you've got, again, as I say, in terms of the usage of fields, the taxonomy in an organization, and using the same field in different places in different ways, different rules, and actually companies understanding their own internal rules, not the talk of.
Oh, that leads us nicely into AI. Actually, that we managed to make it all the way through that talk about AI. So let's just quietly finish on that. I mean, if you're talking about taxonomies, I was talking to one of the analysts the other day about this, and the concept of master data management came up, and I said it's all very well, but all of these tools sit on top of something. You're using some kind of language terminology, which then trickles down into, in effect, some technology language, etc. And if you look at the master data management and you look at the taxonomy, which are so poorly and weakly defined that if you don't spend some time on that, then your AI is completely and utterly worthless, because it's just sitting there looking at just completely random stuff that's coming in. There's no overlay of terminology on top of things. Things aren't defined as this is actually a data element that you're actually going to interact with, as opposed to a process, all of those different types of things. So unless you can spend your time fixing that, and maybe the spin-off of building these sandboxes, in that it's giving you a discipline, which is giving you something which is way more structured, and you should be able to throw AI at the both ends, to be honest. One is to actually be able to simulate testing against this API, using AI interactivity. And then the other one for you, John, you should be able to build out, using those business rules, a much richer set of responses, or be able to respond, almost using AI to give full, fuller responses.
What we plan to do is to use AI to build the business rules. So at the moment we can build a limited set based on what we know. If we have AI and it's learning as a company goes around, every time you generate the next set of Swagger methods, you get better and better and better implementations. It'll never be 100%, I don't think, but it'll be a hell of a lot more usable out of the box, So it's definitely there. So.
Cool. I think we've beaten this one.
Cool.
This particular donkey has been beaten to death here. All right. Well, thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Rich, good stuff as ever.
Okay, John, thanks a lot.
See you next time, chaps. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Why Didn't You Test That podcast. To continue the conversation, head over to curiositysoftware.ie. And don't forget to subscribe for more episodes.